So, a bit of an overview then of what's happened. I mean, you're all here joining this webinar on a Monday evening because we know that climate change is the defining issue of our time. We have all seen the news articles. I think it was Ruth was talking about, she's seen an article in The Guardian. Yes, we've all seen the news articles about the IPCC report that came out in October, and these headlines of, we have 12 years to act on climate change. So it's critical. Climate change is serious. It is harming people right now. It's not a future threat. And we have an opportunity here in Scotland to take real action with this climate change bill. And this new law will determine the action that Scotland takes on climate change for the next 30 years. So it has to answer some pretty big questions and set out some really serious ambition. Will it see Scotland do enough to tackle the climate crisis and do Scotland's fair share of international effort? Will we do it fast enough? Will we do it fair enough? As it stands, the answer to those questions is no. But that's why we're campaigning for real action. So a little bit of background just to explain where this bill has come from. We already have a climate law in Scotland. And maybe just to explain those terms, so a climate bill is a draft law. And the Climate Act is the final law. And when it gets passed by Parliament, it gets signed off by the Queen, then it's an act, and that's the law. So the bill, the draft law, was an election promise from the SNP in the 2016 elections. And they said that they wanted to bring this forward so that Scotland would update our climate ambition in the light of the Paris Agreement. And so the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure you all know, is the new global treaty on climate change, that all countries must work together to limit the global temperature rise. But we already have a climate law in Scotland. We have this nice law. And this is the Climate Change Act that was passed in 2009. At the time when that was passed, it was a really genuinely ambitious and in some aspects world-leading piece of legislation, and it's really important to remember, it's going to be 10 in June, it's really important to remember that a lot of the good things that were in this act were won by campaigners. They were won by people like you taking action, meeting MSPs, people like us who were in the NGOs at the time. So the things that were there were won by campaigners. So it's really important to remember that very often the politicians don't lead by themselves. They go where public pressure pushes them to go. And so this new bill is an update to this. And the bill, the draft law, this was written by government and it was published in May last year, so May 2018. I'll explain in a wee bit more detail later the process of how that becomes a law. But basically now it's up to Parliament. So the government have written this, they've come up with the proposals, and now it goes to Parliament, and Parliament have got a chance to improve it, and that's where we come in, because it's a democratic process and we should all be able to have a say. So to understand what the bill actually does, the bill won't replace the current law wholesale. So we can't sort of take this old one, chuck it out, take this new one. What it does is it replaces parts of the current act. So it will delete parts, it will replace parts of it, and it will put in new parts. So it's kind of like a track change document, which doesn't make it sound very exciting. But if you are tempted to go and read it, then we'll very happily share the links with you. So I'm going to share my screen again and just explain a little bit about what it does and perhaps crucially what it doesn't do. So here we go. You should be able to see my screen again. Yes? I'm looking over. Yes, thank you. Oh, are you on my screen? Sorry. Thanks, Kate. Okay. So, what does the bill do? It does lots of changes to the way that we report things. It does lots of changes to the way that we kind of measure and account for things. But the real substance of it is about the climate targets. And the climate targets are set, we have targets that are set for every single year between now and 2050. The bill only goes as far as 2050. It sets targets for every single year, but we have these kind of more important milestone targets, interim targets, for 2030, 2040, and 2050. And those targets are set in percentage terms, and that's by what percentage should we have cut Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions in that year compared to what the levels were in 1990. So you see here, I've put the 2050 target. They've changed that. The current Act, the old law, has it as 80% to 2050. The new bill changes that to 90%. So that's an extra 10% effort over 30 years. And the 2030 target, which we'll talk about in a bit, which is arguably the most important target, has barely changed. You might have heard a lot of noise and conversation about a net zero target. This is just a screenshot from the bill itself. And this is something that a lot of noise has been made about, net zero target. And a net zero target is the same as 100% emissions cuts, but it's basically about a balance. So it means that we have to achieve a balance between the emissions that we're still releasing, because we will still release emissions, but it's a balance between what we release out into the atmosphere and what we can naturally soak back up again through forests, through peatlands. And so that balance is the net zero emissions target. So this is a new part that the government put in at the beginning of the new bill. But it's important to note that although it's a new part and lots of discussion has been made about it, it says here they may specify a year. So they haven't actually set a year for this net zero target. All they've done is said that in future, ministers could set one if they wanted to do that. And again, as I said, crucially for us, the 2030 target, so what's going to happen in the next decade? Nothing has changed. So this graph, the black line that goes down here, this starts at 1990, up at the top. And this shows how our emissions have gone down over the last 10 years. So you can see that's actually really pretty good progress. And the blue line here, that's the line that we're on with the current law, the 2009 Act. And this one shows you what the bill proposes. So if we look at 2030, we're really not being any more ambitious, marginally more ambitious. And then if you look at the end here, this gap between the blue line and the orange line, that's all the extra emissions that we're saving with this climate change bill, just that little gap between those two lines. And anyone who's read the recent news reports, anyone who's seen the IPCC report in the news, 12 years to save the Earth, anyone who's read anything about even just our own weather, we had the beast from the east 1 year ago, and then we had unseasonably warm February last month. We know climate change is hitting home now, and it's hitting hardest for those people who have done that least to cause it. So we have to act quickly on climate change. Leaving any extra action until nearly 2040 and doing only a tiny bit extra is really can't be considered an adequate response to the climate crisis. So that's what it does. So what does it need to do? Well, it should commit Scotland to urgent action over the next decade. The next 10 years, the IPCC said, are absolutely crucial. Warming is happening now. Climate change is happening now. And every year that we wait, it gets harder. Every year that we wait, the temperature rise is greater. So we need to commit to urgent action in the next 5-10 years to really bring down our emissions in Scotland. And that means two things. It means that we need to change the target in the bill. Remember, I talked, the government have tried to keep this about targets. It means we need to change the 2030 target and increase the number. So the government are currently saying that that should be 66% by 2030. We're saying it should be way more. It should be in the range of 77 to 86%. And we need concrete actions. We need to know how we're going to deliver these short-term cuts. Because so far, what we've seen is a lot of the effort for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions has come from a couple of parts of society. So we've done really well in getting away from fossil fueled electricity, but we've done less well in transport, in food production and agriculture, and how we heat our homes. Those three areas are the kind of three biggest culprits, if you like, for Scotland's climate emissions. So we want to see concrete actions for those actually written into the text of the new law. And we need to see an end date for our contribution to climate change. So that net zero target needs to have a date. For us at Friends of the Earth, we think that date should be 2040. And the coalition that we're part of, Stop Climate Chaos, are calling for that to be 2050 at the absolute latest. And new evidence has been coming forward all the time that shows that Scotland could feasibly do that, at least by 2045. So we need to actually set an end date, set higher targets, and set the actions for what we need to do to deliver those. And that's what this would look like. So again, that's the government's proposal, the orange line, and that green line is what we're calling for at Friends of the Earth Scotland. I know graphs are not that exciting, but all of the kind of area, the area under here, this is all the extra emissions that we save under here. And I'll chat a bit more about this whenever you can see my face again, rather than looking at the graph. But just to talk a bit about what's happened to the bill. So as I mentioned, the bill was published by the government in May 2018, so that's 9 months ago, 10 months ago. And then kind of all went quiet. So what's been happening? Well, for a bill to become a law, it's a 3-stage process. Stage 1 of that 3-stage process is still where we are at the moment. So there's a committee in the Parliament, the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, often called the Eclair Committee. That's made up of 7 MSPs from across SNP, the Conservatives, Labour, and as one Green MSP. And they sort of get given the bill to look at and scrutinise, and then that committee takes it through the 3-stage process in the Parliament. And that committee, they got given the bill in June last year, and then over the summer they had a kind of public consultation. Lots of people wrote into the committee, gave them their views on whether or not they thought it was good enough. Most people said, we don't think it's good enough. Then in the autumn, once a week they had meetings where they invited different experts and different stakeholders to come into the Parliament, sit in front of the committee and talk through different aspects of the bill, but also different aspects of what Scotland should and could do to go further on climate change. We went to give evidence, but they also heard from experts in the transport sector, in agriculture, people who were able to talk about the impacts of climate change facing people across the world right now. They heard from one of the authors of the IPCC report. They had quite a few people in front of them. And that took them all the way up until November. And then the next part of the stage one is that the committee write a report with their recommendations. And that just came out, that report, last Monday. So this was some of the headlines that came out from that report. The committee, it's a really long, really long report. I haven't read it all yet. I've read most of it. I'm doing quite well. It's about 200 pages. And the committee, really, really importantly, they recognised the need to act with much greater urgency. So these are just two headlines that were in the papers last week, one from the BBC, one from The Guardian. They agreed that we need to see much greater urgency in the next 10 years. And they also agreed that a net zero emissions target is necessary. And they made quite a few other, I'll come back away again. They made quite a few other good recommendations. They talked about climate change as being an intergenerational issue, so that this is something that the current government has to act on. Otherwise, we're leaving a greater burden to future generations. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the climate strikes. They recognised that we need to be in line with the IPCC report. And crucially, they recognised something that many of the people in front of them said during evidence, that the government hasn't been clear on what exactly it's aiming for with this bill. So rather than saying, okay, this is the, we're aiming for a 2-degree world or a 1.5 degree world under the Paris Agreement, and then we look at the carbon budget, which is the total amount of carbon that can be burned, can be released into the atmosphere, to be able to keep within that budget, and then we sort of divide that down into what's possible, what's Scotland's fair share of that, and then we set a target. The government did it the other way up, or their advisors did it the other way up, so they started at the bottom, and they said, well, we can have this many electric cars and this many wind turbines, and we can maybe insulate this many roofs, and that'll maybe get us to there by 2030. And we can do a bit with agriculture, and that'll maybe get us to here by 2050. So they were really looking at it the wrong way around, and the committee recognised that that's not the way you tackle climate change. So it called on them to be true to the IPCC report, to be sticking to 1.5, to be talking about urgency, and to be implementing measures that are going to cut emissions across agriculture, transport, homes in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's really, really crucial. It's a really important step. But now the kind of work is on to make sure that we get those recommendations put into the climate change bill. So the next stage is that there will be a vote and a debate in the whole Parliament, because so far this has just been the work of this committee, these 7 MSPs. So there'll be a vote and a debate in the whole Parliament, and at the moment we expect that to happen in the first week of April. We don't have a date for it yet. We'll be able to share a date as soon as we know it. So that's where it stands at the moment. There are quite a few other things I've just kind of kept to the top line in terms of the targets and the level of ambition, because I don't want to completely bamboozle everyone. But there are a few other things that we're calling for in the bill that I'll just briefly mention, and I'm happy to expand on any of them in the Q&A or to send more information afterwards if people are interested. One of the things is a Just Transition Commission. This would be an independent body. We would like to see it set up for the lifetime of the climate bill. That would advise the government on how to work with those industries that are currently dependent on people who have jobs and communities who are dependent on those jobs in high carbon industries. So we're thinking of the oil and gas sector. We could also be thinking of agriculture. Any place, any sector, any community that's dependent on those jobs at the moment, we know that things will have to change, and we want this commission to be set up independent, adequately funded for the lifetime of the bill, that will advise the government on how to make the transition away from those high carbon industries and into low carbon future in a way that will support those workers, support those communities, provide new jobs, new training. So that's one of the really important things that we're pushing for. We're also pushing for a recognition of what we call consumption emissions and better accounting. So at the minute, the climate change bill, and this is standard practice, sort of UN practice, each country measures the greenhouse gas emissions from their own territory, from their own soil, if you like. But what we don't count for is the emissions that we are responsible for from people from other countries that we then import. So if we import food, fuel, materials from other countries, we don't adequately measure those emissions. So it's quite easy to say, for example, what's Scotland going to do on climate change because of China? But we need to recognise that we have a role in the things that we import and other countries import, that we have a role in China's emissions because they're manufacturing things that we're importing. So we're asking for better accounting of what we call consumption emissions, better reporting of them in Parliament so that we start to get a clearer picture of all of the emissions that we're responsible for, not just the ones that are produced in Scotland. We'd also like to see greater mention of climate justice in the bill. Climate justice is a principle, the nice flag behind it. Climate justice is a principle that recognises climate change as not just an environmental issue, but also a social issue. It recognises that people who are harmed first and worst by climate change are not the ones who were responsible for it. It recognises that the countries like Scotland who've benefited from the Industrial Revolution, from emitting fossil fuels, that we have a greater responsibility to act first, to act fastest. So we'd like to see those measures kind of translated into the law, embedded in the law. And a whole host of other policy things. We want to see policy for how we cut emissions from transport, homes, agriculture. But the really crucial thing that ties back to the IPCC, that ties back to the reality of where we are now, is this 2030 target. So we need to see much, much greater action over the next 5 to 10 years with that stronger 2030 target. And that's, if there's one thing to take away, that would be the takeaway, is that we really need action in the next 10 years, because currently we're not doing anything additional.
We'll go through a bit about a bit more on the process and where some of the political parties are, as well as flagging up a few of the dates kind of further down the line that we want to flag up as big moments that we'll be doing more on in the campaign. So I'll try and run through that in about 10 minutes. I also don't have any slides, so I'm afraid you're stuck with just my face, I think is how Zoom works. So to start off with, I'll talk about the stage 1 vote and debate. As Caroline mentioned, the MSPs now have a 200-page report, which is obviously quite massive. The political parties, the MSPs, the researchers, their environmental spokespeople will now kind of be going through that and seeing what aspects of it they want to talk about, what aspects of it they agree with, and what they might want to bring up again in the debate. We think the debate will happen in the first week of April, but it could be slightly earlier. It's been pushed back a few times, so it's kind of a waiting game to see exactly when it'll be. I think Caroline mentioned that there'll be a vote on the bill. At that stage, the vote's only on the general principles, so there's no opportunity for MSPs to amend the bill at that point. It's just a kind of chance for everyone to talk about what they think is in it. It's pretty much a good chance to show off a bit what your policy is, what you think you're going to talk about, and what you might do at later stages. So in that context, is a really big opportunity for us to show MSPs that we want them to talk about it. We want them to be there. We want to have a full chamber for that debate, even if they can't make amendments, because we want to know that climate change in this bill is going to be at the very top of their agenda whenever it does come to amendment time. So you might have, I think some of you had mentioned, I recognise a few names, some folk might have already went and visited their MSP. We've been trying to encourage people to go to their constituency office to talk to them quite directly about climate change and what they want to see in the bill. We know from MSPs, they've told us that the most impactful way to hear their constituents is right where they are, right in their office. That when they come to voting time, when they come to speaking time, that's what's most prominent in their mind, is those people that came on the day. So we have a link to a page where you can let us know if you'd like to do that still. There's obviously another like 3 weeks to go. So we can still kind of help you do that and give you a bit of extra info and a couple of template invitations, things like that that might make it easier. So hopefully Kate can add that link to the chat. Fab. So as well as encouraging you all to meet your MSPs, we're planning a bit of a rally on the day. Again, as I said, because we don't know the debate date, it's still a bit vague. But basically we're going to be doing a sort of running out of time themed rally outside the Scottish Parliament. We're going to be looking for some people to run to the Parliament in full running gear. We're going to be looking for some people to be outside the Parliament waving clocks and making loads of noise. There might even be some sort of fitness instructor giving us all a good warm-up to make sure we're still lively throughout. We're going to have a couple of speakers as well. And at the minute we think that will be in the first week of April, as I said. So once we have that date firmed up, we'll be able to send it round. But if you're able to join us in Edinburgh, that would be brilliant. Feel free to give us a shout. Maybe send us an email if Kate can drop my email into the chat to tell us if you're interested in coming to that, and then I can try and keep you as up to date as possible for that. So once that's finished, then once that vote's done, I mean, we can generally on the vote on the principles, we can expect that it will pass because they're just sort of saying, yes, we're happy that there's going to be an update to their climate change ambition. So it'd be very unlikely that it'll fail. That would be quite devastating. It'd be a lot of work wasted there. But then after that, we move on to the next stages. So there's another 2 stages, which Caroline mentioned briefly. At stage 2, MSPs can put amendments forward, but they're only voted on by the Climate Change Committee. So they'll decide whether or not they think they should go up for a final vote rather than it going to the whole chamber. The vote will happen with all MSPs, and then we move into the final stage 3, where all MSPs can put forward amendments and they'll all be voted on by the full Parliament and every MSP. So that'll be the kind of big day. Not clear on times for these things either. Depending on stage 2, stage 3 could be late autumn, early winter this year. But again, until we know when stage 2 can happen, stage 3 is unclear, and we still don't know when stage 2 is going to happen. So if anyone has any questions on that kind of process, a bit more than that, was quite vague, but it's difficult to get into too much detail, particularly given the timings, but I'm happy to answer any questions on that once we're doing the clarification bit. So maybe a bit of an update on where the political parties are just now, and who we've been talking to and who we've been targeting most with the MSP visits. So I think a few of you might have already seen the Scottish Greens have been pushing their climate emergency bill. They want to see this piece of legislation reworked into an emergency bill. They're fully on board with the FO's 2040 targets. They want more urgent action as well for 2030, and they have a list of policy measures that they want to see put into the bill now. They've been calling for that for quite some time. Scottish Labour in August last year came out in support of the Stop Climate Chaos targets, and also the Independent Commission the Independent Just Transition Commission having a longer lifespan and being statutory independent. So they've also been supportive of a better bill. The Scottish Lib Dems as well came out last year in favour of higher targets. We've not heard them talk too much about what that means and what exactly they're looking for, but we know that they've said that this bill doesn't go far enough in both 2030 and 2040. So aside from those three, we're waiting to hear from the Tories. They haven't told us exactly what they're going to do on the bill, but we've had some really positive feedback from people who've met with Conservative MSPs. They're quite keen to hear out, and I think a few of them are really sympathetic. They're obviously quite dependent on the UK context as well, and they're the Tories down south, so there's a bit of a balance for them there. But the more of a positive case the Scottish Tories can put forward for it, then the more likely that is kind of more broadly. So as part of the Paying Your MSP a Visit campaign, we've been really focusing on the Tories and the SNP, knowing that they've not yet made their mind up. So that's the main reason for that. And obviously the SNP are the government, they've put forward the bill. The bill just now is what their position is. So yeah, it's not ideal. We've been focusing on them and the Tories for the Pay Your MSPs a Visit. And if anyone does want to do that, please just click the link that Kate's put in and I'll be able to get in touch. We've got some, so we've got the invitation. We've also got a resource that'll give you a bit of talking points if you're not sure what to say or exactly what to talk about, and some things that might be particularly persuasive for them. Just give us a shout and I'll send that over. So outside of the bill process, some other big dates to flag up where we know we'll be doing things and that we'd love for you to be able to get involved in that. Next month, the IPCC authors are coming to Edinburgh. So I know Caroline was talking a bit about the report that came out in October last year. Basically, they're having a meeting in Edinburgh in the first week of April as they look to kind of begin the next review process and their next report. So we're expecting it could be kind of the world's leading climate scientists in the middle of Edinburgh, in the middle of this bill process. It could also be on the same week as the Scottish Parliament has their first debate on the bill. So it could be really quite significant and a really big moment for us. And obviously it will just add to the noise of the rally that we're planning, and really draw even more attention on whether or not Scotland's doing what it should do internationally at the time. So then the next month in May, the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is the sort of UK's independent advisory body on climate change targets, will give their answer to a request for evidence that the Scottish and UK government put in following the IPCC report. So basically, once the IPCC report was released, the Scottish government requested an update on the advice and whether, and basically an answer to whether or not what they were doing was sufficient to meet what the IPCC report said. That report will be released on the 2nd of May. And it could be a really, really key moment for us, and we know it will be a key moment for us. Both the SNP and the Scottish Conservatives have basically told us that they're waiting to hear what that request is before they kind of show their hand, for want of a better phrase. And that's also important in a UK context, because if that suggests that the UK can go further as a whole, then obviously we know Scotland can go faster and do more than the UK can as a whole. So that could be really important in pulling these target dates closer and ensuring that we get some of that more rapid action in the next 10 years. So that's on the 2nd of May. Then in June, there are 2 anniversaries. So Caroline mentioned that the Climate Act, the 2009 Act, will be 10 years old. At the same time, or within a week or so, of the Scottish Parliament being 20 years old. So we think that's a really good moment to talk about kind of ambition and vision and what Scotland wants to be, how Scotland puts itself out there internationally, and then what that means in terms of climate change. So 2009 Act, as Caroline said, was genuinely world leading. It had things in it that other countries still don't have, and it was unanimously passed, which I think is a really important part to it, that all parties in the Scottish Parliament really got behind it. And that's helpful not only in getting the bill passed, but in making sure we get the action that follows, because once they've signed up to those targets and that level of ambition, then they can't really backtrack on delivering on it. So we think that's a big moment. It's a great time for us to be talking about the bill as well. So yeah, we'll be doing quite a lot around those 3 moments. I